Chapter 5. Miss Pickerell is Suspicious. The minute Miss Pickerell entered the kitchen, she looked up at the clock on the shelf over the telephone. It was 5 minutes after 5. She was far too angry and upset to want to eat anything. All she could think about was the men in her pasture. She brought her rock collection out to the kitchen table and began to get it ready to enter in the state fair. But Miss Pickerell couldn't keep her mind on this either. She kept looking up at the clock and watching for the captain through the kitchen window. But the captain did not come, nor did anyone else. Apparently the men were going to defy her. Obviously they were going to stay right there until they got ready to leave, while Miss Pickerell's poor sick cow had to remain outside in the lane tied to a tree. Miss Pickerell boiled with the injustice of it. It was now 25 minutes to 6. Half an hour had gone by. Miss Pickerell got some large pieces of white cardboard and a small paintbrush. Then, using the India ink with which she made labels for her rock collection, she lettered several large "No Trespassing" signs. At least she could put these up and keep anyone else from coming to her pasture. Miss Pickerell looked again at the clock. "I'll give them 5 minutes more," she said. She got some nails for the signs and took out her favorite hammer, the one that was so easy to use because its head was a magnet and held each nail until the first blow was struck. If only there were someone she could report the men to! If she lived in a city, she could simply telephone a policeman and tell him that someone had been living in her house without permission. The policeman would make them go away. But Miss Pickerell didn't live in the city, and there weren't any policemen to make the men go away. She thought again about the governor, but she knew the governor had much more important things to worry about. The governor wouldn't be interested unless the men were criminals or spies. Miss Pickerell caught her breath and put her hand to her lips. Perhaps they were criminals or spies. How did she know? Perhaps they were doing something very wrong. They had certainly been most anxious to keep people from knowing what it was. Perhaps she should report them to the governor. Miss Pickerell slipped the magnetic hammer into the commodious pocket of her big apron and crossed the kitchen to the telephone on the wall. She put in a long-distance call for the governor's mansion. It took quite a while for the call to go through, and as she waited, Miss Pickerell hoped she was doing the right thing. She hoped the governor wouldn't be angry. It was the governor's wife who finally answered. She said the governor was busy with a special meeting of his cabinet. Miss Pickerell tried to explain. She told how she had been away from her home for a month, how she had returned to find someone had been using her house and pasture without permission, how she had discovered the enormous metal structure, how secret the men had been about whatever it was they were doing, and how they refused to leave. "I was afraid they might be some kind of spies," Miss Pickerell concluded. "Oh dear," said the governor's wife, "that sounds serious. I think I'd better have the governor call you back. He'll be through in an hour or so." When she had hung up, Miss Pickerell was surprised to find that she was shaking. Now that she had done this thing, she felt a little silly. There wasn't anything more she could tell the governor when he called. Probably the men had a perfectly good reason for whatever they were doing. On the other hand, they might be spies or criminals. It would be an hour before the governor called back. Miss Pickerell decided to see what else she could find out in the meantime. She put a pink sweater on over her apron and went back to her pasture. Chapter 6. An Unexpected Trip. The pasture looked just as it had before, except that Wilbur was not in sight. Miss Pickerell went straight to the gate and opened it. She walked directly to the spaceship, her feet scuffing through the grass, and stepped up on the hideous metal and concrete platform that had been built for the spaceship to rest on. Miss Pickerell looked around. No one was in sight. The interlopers must be above in that contraption. She looked up. Only then did she begin to grasp the size of the spaceship. It towered above her, and the thin metal ladder leading up to it seemed miles long. "Yoo-hoo!" Miss Pickerel called. No answer. "You men!" There was no response. Miss Pickerel opened her mouth to call again, and then she closed it because she had just had a very daring idea. Suppose one of the men did come down to talk to her. Even if he told her the truth about what they were doing in that thing up there, Miss Pickerel would have no way of knowing whether to believe him. No, there was only one way to find out what was going on up there, so that she could give the governor an accurate report. Miss Pickerel closed her eyes and leaned against the ladder. "No, I can't," she whispered to herself. "I just can't. It would make me so dizzy." Again she started to call, and once again she closed her mouth before she had done so. She grasped one of the rungs of the ladder with her hands. She put one foot on the lowest rung. She stood there a moment with her eyes closed, and then she forced herself to climb to the next rung. She dared not look down. Already she was so dizzy that she thought she would fall. Besides that, the hammer in her apron pocket banged against her leg each time she moved. But she made herself reach up to the next rung. She made herself go on. Once, when it seemed she was already miles above the earth, she opened her eyes for just an instant and looked up. The spaceship still loomed far above her. "I can't go on," she whispered. Her hands were damp with perspiration, and her head reeled with dizziness. "I'll have to go down again." At that moment she heard, coming to her faintly through the air, the sound of her cow mooing. It was almost as if the cow were encouraging her, as if the cow were saying, "You can do it, Miss Pickerel. I know you can." Miss Pickerel let out her breath and continued to climb. Just as she thought she could go no farther, her fingers grasped a sort of sill. Miss Pickerel realized that she had reached the spaceship. She dragged herself up to the opening and lay there a moment, half in and half out, with her stomach pressed against the sill. She took one look backward at her cow, and as she did so, she saw something else, but she was too agitated from her climb to pay it much attention. What she saw was the blue-suited figure of Mr. Haggerty hurrying down the lane to the pasture gate, his large briefcase swinging in his hand. Miss Pickerel pulled herself through the opening and through a second doorway just behind it, and then, too weak to stand, she rested for a moment on her hands and knees. She opened her eyes and looked up. She found herself inside a large, partly circular room. At the far side of this room stood two men, looking up at a large panel with a mass of complicated-looking instrument dials. Nearby, at one side of her, Miss Pickerel saw several curved couches or bunks, with deep springs and cushions. One of the men at the other side of the room turned his head partly around, as if he might have heard Miss Pickerel come in. She got to her feet, and as she did so, her dizziness overcame her, and she collapsed into one of the bunks. She heard someone say, "Well, there he is at last." Someone else called out, "Haggerty, where in the world have you been all this time?" Miss Pickerel opened her mouth to say that she wasn't Mr. Haggerty, but before she could speak, someone shouted, "Let her go." There was a heavy clanking sound as the two doors behind her closed. Then there came an ear-splitting hissing and a thunderous rumbling. The bunk beneath Miss Pickerel rose like an explosion. A tremendous force pushed her deep into the springs and cushions of the bunk. She felt as though she would be pushed right through. The force tore away her strength, her breath, everything. She lost consciousness. Chapter 7. Miss Pickerel in Space. When Miss Pickerell came again to her senses, the pressure was gone, but in place of it was a strange, giddy, light sensation, as if she had no weight at all. Miss Pickerell had never been this dizzy in her life. She was frightened. She wondered if she dared to move. She was almost afraid to open her eyes, but she did, just a little. Across from Miss Pickerell was another curved bunk, similar to the one in which she was lying. A man was sitting in the middle of this bunk. He was shaking his head slowly and going, "Tch, tch, 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 tch." "Lady," he said, "you have absolutely no business being here." "You had absolutely no business being in my pasture," said Miss Pickerell. "What happened? Was there an explosion?" "Nothing like the explosion there's going to be when the captain finds out about this." "That reminds me," Miss Pickerell said. "I want to see this captain of yours." She moved her arm and started to sit up. The most amazing thing then happened. The bare movement of her arm lifted her quite out of the bunk where she was lying. The man across from her reached out and pushed her gently back. "Better fasten that strap across your lap, lady," he said, "if you don't want to float away." "Stop calling me lady," Miss Pickerell said. "My name is Miss Pickerell." "I'm Killian," said the man, "executive officer of this ship. Hate to think what the captain is going to say when I have to tell him about you." Miss Pickerell fastened the strap Mr. Killian had indicated. "Thank you, Executive Officer Killian," she said. "This strap does make me feel more secure. Just call me Mr. Killian." Miss Pickerell sat up, and this time she did not float out of her bunk. She saw that Mr. Killian was a middle-aged man with an impassive face and leathery-looking skin. Even in this artificial light, Miss Pickerell could see that his brown hair had faded streaks. Mr. Killian gave her the impression of being a man who had spent most of his life out of doors, buffeted by the wind and burned by the sun. But she was concerned at the moment with her own sensations. "I don't understand what has happened," she said. "Why do I feel so light?" "Because we're traveling through space." "But we can't be," Miss Pickerell said. "We aren't even moving. I can tell by the feeling that we're standing perfectly still." "Just seems that way," Mr. Killian said. "We're moving all right, straight up." "Forevermore!" Miss Pickerell exclaimed. "You mean we're in the stratosphere?" She had heard from her nieces and nephews about airplanes that fly very rapidly through the stratosphere high above the earth. "I never imagined the stratosphere was like this, and I never would have thought this thing could really take off. It was so big." "Probably used to airplanes," said Mr. Killian. "Why, of course I am," said Miss Pickerell. "I ought to be. I've had to hear so much about them from my nieces and nephews. They'll be so interested when I tell them about this big airplane and how it took off pointing straight up into the stratosphere." "Past the stratosphere," Mr. Killian said. "Long ago." Miss Pickerell said, "I believe I'll send my nieces and nephews a telegram when we land." "How soon will that be, Mr. Killian? And just where is it we are going, anyway?" "Be a long, long time before we land," Mr. Killian said darkly, "if we ever do. And where we're going you won't be able to send any telegrams." Miss Pickerell saw something moving out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head and gasped at what she saw. What she saw was the young man, Wilbur. But Wilbur was not walking. Wilbur was swimming. Yes, actually swimming right across the room, without even touching the floor. He had emerged from one of two openings in a partition beside the panel of instruments. "Why, hello there, Miss Pickerell," Wilbur said. He tipped his cap, and then, instead of putting it back on, he released it from his fingers. The cap remained suspended in the air. "Forevermore," Miss Pickerell said. Wilbur turned to Mr. Killian. "Did you tell the captain Miss Pickerell came with us? Was he mad?" "Haven't told him yet," Mr. Killian said. "Not supposed to interrupt him. Still busy over there in his own compartment. What's he doing in there anyway?" "Writing a speech," Wilbur said, "to give when we get back to Earth." "Back to Earth!" Miss Pickerel exclaimed. "Why, what are you talking—" "Might as well save himself the trouble," said Mr. Killian. "Probably never get there now. Not without Haggerty." Wilbur's face went quite white. He reached up to a ring in the ceiling above him and steadied himself in the air. He spoke in a hoarse, frightened voice. "You mean we left Haggerty behind? Why, Mr. Killian, who's going to do the calculations for our flight?" "I'm not," Mr. Killian said flatly. "I don't know how. All I know how to do is tell if we're on our course or off it. Guess I'd better check the instruments." He unfastened the strap which had been holding him down and floated across to the instrument panel. Wilbur, nervous and frightened, swam along close beside him. Neither man paid any further attention to Miss Pickerel. She thought this was extremely rude of them. They hadn't even given her a chance to tell them that Mr. Haggerty was right down there on the ground, and all they had to do was go back and get him, if it was so important. Chapter 8. The Captain Gets a Shock. From across the room came a low buzz of conversation where Mr. Killian and Wilbur were floating in front of the instrument panel and earnestly studying various dials and gauges. Miss Pickerel decided this would be a good time to have a talk with the captain. The men might be afraid to interrupt him, but she certainly wasn't. It seemed quite warm in the spaceship, and Miss Pickerel took off her pink sweater and pressed it down against the surface of her bunk. She unclamped the belt across her lap. At first, Miss Pickerel wasn't quite sure how she should leave her bunk, whether she ought to put her feet out first or whether she should go head first. And for one awful moment she thought, "What if the air doesn't hold me up?" But she knew that was silly. If Wilbur and Mr. Killian could swim through the air, she certainly could too. Miss Pickerel put her hands beneath her and pushed herself up. But this was unnecessary. Now that the belt was unfastened, she simply floated right out into the room. She held her breath. "Why, it's magic," she said to herself. "I've never felt anything like this, and I'm not a bit dizzy." She bounced delicately against the ceiling, feeling exactly as if she were a balloon. In a few moments, Miss Pickerel learned how to guide her movements. The rings she found set at intervals across the ceiling were a help. She noticed, too, that there were handholds all around the circular wall of the room. The men were conferring at the instrument panel. They seemed so absorbed in their problem as to have forgotten all about Miss Pickerel. She was about to ask where she would find the captain when a crisp, sharp voice called out, "Mr. Haggerty, come here immediately." The voice seemed to come from one of the openings in the partition. Miss Pickerel swam toward it. "You tell him, Wilbur," she heard Mr. Killian say. "No, you," said Wilbur. "You're the executive officer." "Don't bother," Miss Pickerel called out. "I'll explain." She swam through the opening just as the voice was calling again, "Mr. Haggerty, come here." This enclosure was much smaller than the large room. Around its edges were a number of very complicated-looking pieces of equipment, none of which made much sense to Miss Pickerel. In the middle of this small compartment was an adjustable cushioned chair. The chair was turned with its back to the opening, so that all Miss Pickerel could see of the man sitting in it was that he had short, iron-gray hair and a fat red neck. The man called again, "Mr. Haggerty!" Miss Pickerel, looking down from over the top of his head, saw him angrily unsnap a belt which had been holding him in the chair. He pushed himself up with his hands. "Careful," Miss Pickerel said. "Don't bump your head on the ceiling." The man turned around in the air and stared at her. Miss Pickerel thought she had never seen such a startled man. Beneath the short crew-cut of his iron-gray hair, his bright blue eyes bulged wide in his plump, red face. "Good gracious," he said, almost in a whisper. "Who in the world are you?" And then, even before Miss Pickerell could answer, he shouted so loud that it hurt her ears, "Mr. Haggerty!" "It won't do you any good to shout like that," Miss Pickerell said. "Mr. Haggerty can't possibly hear you from down there on the ground." She steadied herself by holding a ring in the ceiling. The captain reached out one hand to the chair below him, and with the other he held his forehead. "This can't be happening," he said. "It can't really be." Then he called in a lower tone of voice, "Mr. Killian, Wilbur, come here." Mr. Killian and Wilbur floated in immediately. "Has anybody made the introductions?" Wilbur asked. "Miss Pickerell, this is Captain Crandall." "How do you do, Captain Crandall?" Miss Pickerell said. "I really just came in here to ask you about how soon it will be before I can get home again, and to tell you—" "Who let this happen?" asked the captain in a stern voice. "Nobody," Mr. Killian said. "She just got on all by herself." "That's not what I'm talking about," said the captain. "We'll go into that matter later. What I want to know now is how we happen to have left without Mr. Haggerty." "It's very easy to understand, Captain Crandall," Miss Pickerell said. "These men just made a very natural mistake. When they heard me get on, they thought I was Mr. Haggerty and started the ship. I don't imagine any real harm's been done, because I saw Mr. Haggerty coming into the pasture just as I got to the top of the ladder. I'm sure he'll wait until you go back for him." Captain Crandall looked at Mr. Killian. "Are we on our course?" Mr. Killian nodded. "Guess so, near as I can tell. But say—" "Do not address me as 'say,'" said Captain Crandall. "Let us try to maintain a little dignity on this voyage, even if we have left our navigator behind, and even if we do have a stowaway." "Yes, sir," Mr. Killian said. "I only wanted to call your attention, sir, to the instruments." "What about them?" "Some of them don't seem to be giving the right readings. If anything happens to the instruments, sir, we're sunk, sir." "I don't think you need to worry about that," Miss Pickerell said. "I'm sure Mr. Haggerty can fix any instruments that might go wrong. He seems to be very good at that sort of thing. At least he fixed my car very easily. So as soon as you take me back—" The captain looked at her icily. "Would you mind keeping still for just a minute, Miss—" "Pickerell," said Wilbur. "Miss Pickerell." "I'm only trying to help," Miss Pickerell said. "Naturally, I'm sorry if you have been inconvenienced, but it just happens that it wasn't very convenient for me either. I have a sick cow down there on the ground. Besides that, I want to get my rock collection ready for the state fair. That's one of the reasons I came in here. I wanted to ask you how soon—" "She talks about inconvenience," the captain said through clenched teeth. "Miss Pickerell, do you have any idea at all of the seriousness of what's happened?" "Only that I think you're making too much of this thing, Captain Crandall. Everybody makes mistakes. It surely can't matter a great deal if you have to go back and make a second start. You'll only be a few hours later getting to wherever you're going." "A second start," she says. Captain Crandall held his head with both hands as if he were afraid it might split apart. "I don't want to be unreasonable," Miss Pickerell said. "If it's really so important for you to keep right on going, I won't insist that you take me back. But I should think you'd want to go back on account of Mr. Haggerty." "Miss Pickerell," Captain Crandall said, "nothing would give me greater pleasure than immediately returning you to wherever it is you came from, even disregarding the matter of Mr. Haggerty. But the inescapable fact is that we can't go back." "That's right," Mr. Killian said. "Course was preset before we started." "How ridiculous," Miss Pickerell said. If you're using some kind of an automatic pilot, you can certainly turn it off and pilot the ship yourselves." "It's scarcely a question of piloting," Captain Crandall said. "When you start out on such an expedition as ours, when you set out in a spaceship to go to another planet, then everything must be very carefully worked out in advance. Even then, something could go wrong with the calculations. That is why we would never have dreamed of starting without Mr. Haggerty." "What was that you said about a planet, Captain Crandall?" "Mars is a planet, Miss Pickerell." "Mars!" Miss Pickerell exclaimed. "Why, Captain Crandall, I never heard of anything so ridiculous as expecting to get to Mars. Have you ever looked at Mars up in the sky?" "It happens, Miss Pickerell, that I have made a rather exhaustive study of Mars." "Then I don't see how you could ever have such a silly idea as trying to go to that tiny little bit of a red star." "I know it's called a planet, but it looks just like all the other stars, except that it's redder than most of them. Even the time I saw it through a 10-cent telescope at the State Fair, it didn't look any different. Why, Mars must be millions of miles away." Mr. Killian said, "I'm going out to look at the instruments." "Miss Pickerell," Captain Crandall said, "if you come to a good stopping place, I'd like to say a word. Is it your habit to talk constantly?" "Why, I hardly talk at all," Miss Pickerell said. "I don't usually have anyone to talk to, living all alone the way I do. And that reminds me, Captain Crandall, I have a bone to pick with you for trespassing on my farm. Now, as soon as we get back, I want you to—" A frightened shout from Mr. Killian at the panel of instruments in the larger room interrupted them. Without even excusing themselves, the captain and Wilbur swam rapidly away. Miss Pickerell sighed. Captain Crandall was certainly a very difficult man to talk to. She hadn't settled a thing with him about getting back to her cow and her rock collection. Until next time.